You scroll through the comments section online, and you've probably seen something just like this. Someone says, if you actually lived by biblical morality today, you'd be locked up for a very long time. The Bible is the last place anyone should look for morals. That is a really powerful accusation, right? So in this explainer, we're going to dive deep into why that idea might be based on a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of what the Bible is actually about. There it is in black and white. And look, let's be fair. When you read some parts of the Old Testament, you can totally see why someone might think this. The idea is pretty straightforward. Biblical morality is just so ancient and brutal that if you tried to live it out today, you'd literally be a criminal. That's a heavy charge, and it really deserves a careful response, not just brushing it off. And this really gets to the heart of the matter. When Christians say they follow the Bible's moral teachings, but, they don't follow the dietary laws in Leviticus, are they just picking and choosing what they like? Is it some kind of moral buffet? That's the central question we're going to dig into.
So to even get close to an answer, we first have to figure out what we're even talking about. Because when a critic says biblical morality, they're often painting with an incredibly broad brush. And as we're about to see, that's exactly where the misunderstanding gets started. What tends to happen is that everything gets thrown into one giant, and let's be honest, kind of intimidating pile. You've got ancient Israel's civil penalties, temple rituals, all 613 laws from the Torah, and the Sermon on the Mount. But here's the thing. The Bible's core moral teachings, to love God, love your neighbor, tell the truth, seek justice, are remarkably consistent. And frankly, they're things that most people, even many critics, would say are fundamentally good. And this shows us what the real debate is all about. It's not about whether love and justice are good things. I mean, of course they are. The real debate is whether the specific law code given to the nation of Israel thousands of years ago is the exact same thing as God's enduring moral will for all people at all times. And the Bible itself actually makes a pretty clear distinction between those two. Okay, now this is where the tension really ratchets up, and it's where that whole cherry-picking accusation gets its power. It comes from what looks like a direct conflict between what Jesus said about the law and what the Apostle Paul wrote about it. And if they're not on the same page, well, then it sure looks like Christians are just picking a side, doesn't it? So critics will often go straight to this verse from Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Not the smallest letter, not even the least stroke of a pen, will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." And yeah, on the surface, that sounds like a totally ironclad command to uphold every single one of those 613 laws forever. But then you put that right next to Paul, who tells believers that they are not under law, but under grace. I mean, wow, that looks like a major contradiction, doesn't it? So which is it? Are people just supposed to pick whichever one feels more convenient? This is the problem we have to solve. So, how do we solve this? Is there a key that unlocks this apparent contradiction? Well, the answer is yes, and it's a single, crucial word that Jesus himself uses in the exact same passage right before he talks about the jot and tittle, and that word is fulfill. Jesus says, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Now, to fulfill something isn't to get rid of it. It's to bring it to its intended goal, its ultimate purpose. It's like a blueprint being fulfilled in a finished building. That's why in that same sermon, Jesus doesn't weaken the law. He actually intensifies its moral demands, pushing past our outward actions straight to the motives of our heart, from murder to anger, from adultery to lust. This shows the flow perfectly. The old covenant law given to national Israel, it was like a shadow pointing forward to something real. Jesus is the fulfillment. He's the reality that the shadow was pointing to all along. And so now, believers live in that reality, under what Paul calls the law of Christ. So you see, Paul isn't contradicting Jesus at all. He's just explaining what it looks like to live in the reality that Jesus brought about. So Jesus and Paul are not at odds. They both completely agree on the most important point. God's moral character, his holiness, his justice, that is absolutely unchanging. What has changed is the covenant system, the administration of that law. We've moved from that temporary arrangement with national Israel to the permanent reality we have in Christ. Okay, so now that we have this framework of fulfillment in our minds, we can start to see how the Old Testament law can be applied in a way that's consistent and coherent, not just random. Let's go right back to that accusation. It's a really memorable image, right? This idea of a Chinese buffet where we just pick the tasty, easy-to-swallow parts of the Old Testament. But as we're seeing, having a structured theological framework is the exact opposite of a buffet. It's more like a carefully prepared, multi-course meal where every single part has its place and its purpose in the bigger story. Now, what's so interesting here is that this is a system Christian thinkers have used for centuries to make sense of the Old Testament. This isn't some new idea made up to dodge hard questions. They've long distinguished between three types of law: moral, civil, and ceremonial. The moral law reflects God's eternal character. It gets reaffirmed. The civil law was for Israel as a specific nation-state. It's fulfilled. And the ceremonial law pointed ahead to Jesus' sacrifice. It's also fulfilled. You see? This isn't random. It's a structured, time-tested approach. Let's make this super concrete. The rule against murder is based on an eternal truth. Humans are made in God's image. So that moral law is reaffirmed and even deepened in the New Testament. But the dietary laws? Well, they were designed to mark Israel as a unique nation for a temporary period of time. Once the good news of Jesus goes out to all nations, those temporary markers are explicitly set aside. The Bible itself shows us how and why we should make this distinction.
And this brings us all the way back to where we started. If you lived by true biblical morality, would it actually land you in prison? And the answer is a pretty clear no. Now, if by biblical morality you mean trying to copy-paste ancient Israel's entire civil code into a 21st century country, then yeah, you've misunderstood the Bible's own story. But if you mean living by God's unchanging moral will, a life of love, justice, faithfulness, and truth, all fulfilled and clarified by Jesus, then you're talking about the very foundation of what our culture still, for the most part, recognizes as good. You could even argue that a lot of our modern moral ideas are just powerful echoes of this very same biblical morality. So we'll end by just turning the question around. We've been talking about the coherence of biblical morality, but if you reject God as the ultimate, unchanging anchor for what is right and wrong, what's left? What ultimately grounds your own moral judgments and keeps them from just being, the shifting preferences of our culture in this particular moment? It's definitely a question worth some serious thought.